Alright, we're here. We're going to do a deck tech on the green-black rock deck that I've been playing in standard on some of my videos. Just going to let you know how some of the card choices work, what each of the cards is for, just the general strategy of the deck. So we'll start with the mana base. So we've got one Encroaching Waste. This is just an answer to mostly Maze's End. It also does some work against Mutavaults and against Underworld connections. We've got some basics. We've got forests, swamps. We have Overgrown Tombs, Llanowar Waste, and Temple of Maladies, just as our dual lands. We're running all the good dual lands, none of the guild gates. I had Evolving Wilds in here, but it wasn't great. It's just a little bit too slow. You don't want to have a lot of tapped lands when you're trying to defend yourself. And then we've got one Urborg. We run a little bit extra on the forest because the Urborg is here. And then some more card choices make it good to have extra forest. We'll get into that later. So we're going to just go through this by mana curve. At our 1-drop, all we have in the main deck is just a playset of 4 Thoughtseize. Thoughtseize is just a very versatile answer. It's reasonable against every deck, and it's very good against decks like Mono Black and Blue-White Control, where you just want to take some specific cards out of their hand before they have the ability to cast them. It's also important against Mono Black to be able to Thoughtseize their Thoughtseize so that they can't take your answer to their Pack Rat. So then 2 drops, we have 3 Bile Blight, 3 Abrupt Decay. These are your 2 mana answer spells. When you're on the play, you can kill a 1-drop immediately with these. It's important to have a good number of cheap removal spells in this format because there are a lot of very strong cheap creatures. When you're choosing removal spells, what you want to be able to do, you want to be able to kill Rakdos Cackler, Pack Rat, and then other similar creatures. And then anything else that you can get with your things is just a bonus. So Bile Blight's very good against multiples of creatures. It's good against tokens. Abrupt Decay is good against Domri Raid and Underworld connections. So I've got 3 of each right now, which has been a good number so far. I don't find myself wanting a lot more 2-mana removal spells. We also have the Sylvan Caryatids. Sylvan Caryatid fixes our mana a little bit. We have a lot of double black and double green spells. And it also gets us up to 4 mana or a Courser plus a land on turn 3. For 3 mana spells, we've got 3 Courser of Kruphix in the main deck. This guy is a good blocker. He puts a little bit of pressure on, but he's mainly in there to just make sure you hit a lot of land drops. You want to hit a lot of land drops with this deck. As we see, we have 26 lands in the deck, plus Caryatids, plus 3 Coursers. It's just very important to be able to get to this high end of stuff over here. So Sylvan Caryatid is also a very good blocker. It's a 3 toughness guy with hexproof. It'll block all the guys like Rakdos Cackler, Fire Drinker Satyr sometimes, Legion Loyalist, all the guys out of the red deck, as well as Soldier of the Pantheon, and often Experiment 1. And then if people are running random things like if you run into somebody with Coursers, Caryatid will block their Coursers, or Zathrid Reanimator out of the human decks. Caryatid's just a very good blocker against a lot of the small creatures in the format while fixing your mana and accelerating you. So the Courser Caryatid combo is very strong because it lets you play the Courser before you play your land on your 3rd turn, which means you get to look at the top card of your deck. If it's a land, you just put it into play for free and gain life. We've got 2 main deck heroes downfalls. This is just for the larger creatures that you can't kill with the Bile Blight or the Abrupt Decay. If we were running like Doomblade or Ultimate Price in some of these spots, it wouldn't be as necessary to have the main deck heroes downfalls. I do like to have some of them just to be able to go after opposing planeswalkers in the Jund matchup and against Blue-White Control. And then in our 3 slot, we also have 3 copies of Read the Bones, which just lets you draw extra cards. There's a lot of scrying in this deck. We have Temples, Read the Bones, Reapers, and then after sideboard we have some more. Combined with the Lilianas, you just get to see a lot of cards, dig very deep into your deck, and get to your 1-of answers. So for the 1s, the 2s, and the 3s, we have a lot of redundancy going on. We want our first couple of turns to play out very similarly every game. We just want to either play a Thoughtseize or a tapped land on turn 1, then turn 2, just stall the board a little bit either by killing a creature or by playing a blocker, And then turn 3 is where we start to get into interesting stuff. Against control, we're going to play Read the Bones. Against aggro, we're going to play Courser. Against mid-range, we may kill something like a Pelucranos. And then with our Caryatids, we also have access to all of these. So our 4-drops is where we start to move into more of the silver bullet, tutor target kind of things. We have 1 Erebos, God of the Dead. Erebos is very strong in the blue-white matchup, especially if they're on the version that has no detention spheres or banishing lights and are instead running planar cleansing to deal with threats. Because Erebos is indestructible, he's just going to sit and play, drawing cards, preventing them from gaining the life off of Sphinx's Revelation. Erebos just by himself makes that matchup much, much easier in Game 1. We also have a single copy of Silence the Believers. Silence the Believers is very important in the mid-range matchups. If you can kill like a Stormbreath Dragon and a Pelucranos, for example, against red-green monsters, you're going to do a ton of work. You've done almost more damage than they can usually come back from. Unless they have an active Planeswalker, killing 2 of their monster creatures is just going to completely shut them down. You also have options against, for example, white-black mid-range. You can kill an Obzidot, Ghost Council, and a Desecration Demon at the same time. Just completely blow them out of the water. It also prevents graveyard shenanigans, for example, Whip of Erebos, or now Restock is in the format. So there's Souls from M15, so Soul of Innistrad, Soul of Theros are some of the better ones. You can just exile them completely. Also, Scuttling Doom Engine, you can exile it, it won't trigger and deal damage and kill your planeswalkers or you. So it's a little bit pricey at 4 mana for the first target, then 3 mana for each subsequent target. But if you can just cast it for 7 mana, you often have established such a strong advantage that you just win the game right there. And even at 4 mana for 1 creature, you're often just maintaining parity. You're spending 4 mana to deal with their Pelucranos that cost them 4 mana, their Stormbreath Dragon that cost them 5 mana, or even in response to the monstrous ability. So you're often not too far behind. And it's not great against the faster aggressive decks, but it is a live card. It's going to do things if you have 4 mana, so it's not dead. It's worth running 1 in the main deck for sure. We also have a single Whip of Erebos. Whip of Erebos is very, very strong in the burn matchup. It's also good against the aggressive red decks, and it does some work against the control decks by recurring a creature and just getting in for some more damage. It's also a combo with the Hornet Queen, which we'll look at later. You can recur the Hornet Queen, you'll get the tokens, and then you'll get to keep the tokens even after the Hornet Queen has been exiled. So it's a very strong card. 1 is the right number. They don't do anything at all in multiples, and it's very rare that they get killed, especially in the matchups where you actually care about them, which would be burn. They do die against the planar cleansing decks, but generally you're going to board them out in that matchup anyway. They're not doing a ton of work. If you can get 1 activation of the ability, you're probably getting a card's worth of value off of the whip in that matchup. Then we have 3 Reaper of the Wilds. I tested Pelucranos in this deck. I didn't like him a lot. He was very... You would think that a 5 mana or a 5 power, 5 toughness creature would not be very fragile, but he just doesn't match up well against a lot of the removal that people are playing. The blue decks have Rapid Hybridization and Tidebinder Mage. The black decks are running Hero's Downfall, often Ultimate Price, sometimes Doomblade. The blue-white decks have Supreme Verdict as well as Planar Cleansing, or if they're on the Detention Sphere Banishing Light version. There's just a bunch of answers for Pelucranos, and he doesn't really give you much advantage unless your opponent has small creatures that you can kill with his monstrous ability, and even to do that you're spending a large amount of mana. It's 4 mana to get him into play, and then another 5 mana just to kill 1/2 toughness creature. So he's very mana intensive, and again, very fragile to match up against the removal that people are playing. So instead I've been playing Reaper of the Wilds. I've been very satisfied with her in the deck. She can at least trade in almost every combat. The only creatures that are really strong against her in combat would be Soul of Innistrad, Soul of Theros, and then things that people aren't really playing, like Master of Cruelties, or if they have Legion Loyalists and a large amount of pump spells, they can also power through a Reaper. But the Death Touch ability does a lot of work, just making sure that your Reaper is always getting you value. The ability to gain hexproof for 2 mana is incredibly strong. It shuts down a lot of the answers that made Polukranos so fragile in the deck. And then the first ability, which scries whenever another creature dies, is also very, very strong. In a deck with so many singleton copies like we have, I believe, 6 silver bullets plus the encroaching waste, and the Urborg is 1 of lands. Just being able to see a lot of cards in one turn and keep the one you want is very strong. I've had turns where I killed several creatures in combat with 2 Reapers in play and just have 8 or 10 scry triggers. Just get 10 cards deeper into your deck to look for what you need. At the 5 mana spot, we have 3 Liliana Vess. Liliana is really the reason that the deck works the way it does in game 1 at least. In the sideboard, you'll see that we have ways to add some more redundancy to the deck. But main deck, we have a lot of single copies that we can tutor for. And while we do have a lot of scrying and Courser to look at extra cards, Liliana is what really powers the deck with her ability to just search your library for any card and then draw that next turn, or if you have the Read the Bones, just get it into your hand immediately. So you can have a lot of single copies of powerful but narrow cards, because with 3 Liliana, you have a lot of ability to just go and get what you need out of your deck when you need it. The +1 ability is very strong against the control decks, and it's also very strong against burn decks, because each time you make them discard a card, their decks are built on the philosophy that each card they draw is worth an average of about 2 damage. So when you have Liliana, you're also working on the philosophy that each card that you make them discard is going to gain you roughly 2 life. They often have things like extra lands or Chandra's Phoenix that can make that not perfectly true, but sometimes you do hit discard spells and it's very effective to get those out of their hand. If they also choose to pressure Liliana with their burn spells, you're gaining even more life, because she comes down at 6 loyalty and makes them discard a card. They're going to need 2 more burn spells to kill her, so you're getting at least 3 cards out of it. 3 cards against burn is very strong. And then surprisingly to me, I actually have been able to use her final ultimate ability fairly regularly in the matchups where it's good. Against decks like white-green aggro or Brave Naya, any base white or base green creature deck, they don't have a lot of strong ways to kill a planeswalker without attacking. And if you can use Coursers and Reapers and even Hornet Queen to gum up the ground so they can't get through, it's often very possible to reach that 3rd activation that puts her at 8 and threatens the final ability. And then once you've done that against a deck that's a base creature deck, it's very hard for them to win. You've generally killed many of their creatures, and then you've stolen those creatures, which gives you a large army, which is just very hard for them to overcome with the few creatures that they have remaining after discarding 3 cards and having their creatures pressured by your removal spells. So here we have an interesting card. We've got one main deck, Ancient Silverback. Now, this guy doesn't look like a powerful card. In fact, he's been printed several times and never really done much in any metagame. However, the reason that I really like him now is because the blue-white control decks are now switching over mostly to the version which won the recent Pro Tour, which consists mainly of Supreme Verdict and Planar Cleansing, accompanied by Quicken as their removal suite. They have some Azorius Charms which can still deal with Ancient Silverback, but the primary way that they're planning on controlling the board is with things that destroy but allow regeneration. So Ancient Silverback will stick and play a lot of the time if they don't counter it, and then he just applies a large amount of pressure at 6 damage every turn. It is possible for them to survive, especially if they have an Elspeth or several Mutavaults to block for a while they establish advantage with Sphinx's Revelation, but Ancient Silverback is just one of the best threats that I've found to pressure those decks specifically. He's also very strong against Mono Black Devotion, because he doesn't die to Hero's Downfall, Bile Blight, Doomblade, Ultimate Price, Ulcerate. He does die to Devour Flesh occasionally, but you often have Caryatids or Coursers that you can sacrifice to that instead. And Silence the Believers is not a card that has been very popular, certainly not in numbers more than 1 or 2 in the entire 75 card list. So Ancient Silverback is very versatile and very, very hard to kill in a lot of the matchups where you want a hard to kill large creature. Finally, at our 7 drops, we have Hornet Queen, who we touched on briefly before. Hornet Queen is 6 power of flying creature for only 7 mana. That's a little bit expensive for these days. However, it's split up across 5 creatures, all of which also have Death Touch. So while normally a 6 power flying creature would only be a good offensive threat, Hornet Queen is also very strong defensively. Hornet Queen can come down and immediately stabilize a board where before your opponent may have thought that there was no way that you could draw out. It's almost like a Plague Wind, but it's a Plague Wind that gives your opponent some way to play around it. For example, if they have Anger of the Gods, they can kill all of your insects and attack in. But most of the time, Hornet Queen will come down and just completely shut down your opponent's offense for several turns. And often it can win the game by itself, just because you play it, you block 2 or 3 of your opponent's creatures, and then you have several flying bodies left over that you can attack with and put pressure on your opponent. Finally, we have 1 Garruk, Apex Predator. Garruk is a very strong planeswalker, but he does cost 7 mana. So his abilities are very interesting and very good in a lot of different matchups. The first ability, +1 to destroy another target planeswalker, is very strong against blue-white, but it's also very strong against the Jund Planeswalker decks and the green-red Monsters decks, which are still factors in the metagame, especially after the Pro Tour. There are a lot of Planeswalkers in this metagame, and being able to destroy them as a plus ability gives you some good value. The other +1 ability creates a 3/3 black Death Touch Beast token. 3/3 is a very meaningful body a lot of the time, even without Death Touch. When you factor in the Death Touch, Garruk is able to put out an army of creatures that are both very effective blockers and very difficult to block profitably. He can just kill your opponent very quickly by himself, and if you back him up with something as simple as a Reaper of the Wilds or a Whip of Erebos, you can create an advantage that's very difficult for your opponent to overcome. The -3 ability destroys a creature and gains life equal to its toughness for you. So while you often don't care about the life from this card, it is relevant in some matchups, such as the red Rabblemaster Goblin decks. And it's also relevant against Burn, where you care not so much about destroying their creature, which is usually just a Chandra's Phoenix, but instead about just gaining the 2 life and just giving yourself another card's worth of value against them, and then leaving a Planeswalker in play that they need to spend another card on. The ultimate ability doesn't come up very often. Usually by the time you've +1 Garruk 3 times, your opponent has either conceded or drawn a Hero's Downfall or Dreadbore to just kill the Garruk. So the ultimate does not come up on Garruk very often, unlike Liliana. People will usually concede the game to Garruk if they can't immediately answer it, whereas Liliana, they're happy to continue to discard lands for a couple of turns and try and draw an out. So that's the main deck. We're going to take a minute to look at the sideboard now. So let's sort this by converted mana cost and give you a look at it. So we've got Elixir of Immortality. Elixir of Immortality is very good against the burn decks, and it also is good against control decks where you leave the Lilianas in, because it lets you re-tutor for a card that you've tutored for and then had your opponent dealt with. So let's say your opponent was able to kill your Ancient Silverback, but not your Liliana. You can use Elixir of Immortality to shuffle your graveyard back into your deck, and then use Liliana's -2 ability to tutor for your Ancient Silverback, or your Whip of Erebos, or your Erebos. Just whatever you need to be able to get an advantage and continue to put pressure on your opponent and present them with things that they have to answer. The life gain is also relevant against Burn, where paying 3 mana to gain 5 life is actually reasonable. You're looking to just draw out the game and run them out of cards, and gaining 5 life is often worth 2 or 3 of their draw steps, especially if they don't draw into War Leader's Helix or Stoke the Flames that are dealing you 4 damage at a time. On our 3-drop, we have 1 Courser of Kruphix. Courser is good for all the reasons I mentioned for the ones in the main deck. You just bring the 4th one in matches where your opponent is very aggressive. I was running 4 in the main deck, but I decided to add a 26th land because I was just having trouble drawing enough lands to support all the expensive spells that really made the deck able to win games quickly after it had stabilized. We also have a single Reclamation Sage. Reclamation Sage is an interesting card. You would think that it would only come in against decks like Constellation or Trading Post, but it also does a lot of work against decks like Mono Black Devotion, which are reliant on their underworld connections to establish a long-term advantage. It can also come in against the red aggressive decks if they're running things like Madcap Skills or Eidolon of the Great Revel. It just gives you a 2-for-1 and gives you a blocker, which is two very strong things you want to do. Again, this is an attrition-based deck. You win by running your opponent out of cards and then presenting a threat that they can no longer deal with easily or effectively. We have another Hero's Downfall on the sideboard to bring in just for matchups where Bile Blight and Abrupt Decay are not strong enough removal. Again, we're dealing with things like Polukranos, Stormbreath Dragon, Elspeth, or Xenagos the Reveler, and we just want to be able to have an answer to those cards that's simple and effective without having to deal with combat damage or blocking or things like that. We just want to be able to point a card at it and make the problem go away. We have 4 copies of Drown in Sorrow. Drown in Sorrow is very strong, but very narrow. It's only really powerful in the red aggressive decks. The green base and white base aggressive decks often have things like Fleecemane Lion and Loxodon Smiter. So while Drown in Sorrow may be playable against them and often comes in depending on their list, it's not nearly as strong as it is in the red matches, where you can often kill 4 or 5 creatures plus any enchantments that may be on them. You just immediately stabilize the game, you deal with all of your opponent's threats at once, and if you have a Caryatid, a Courser, or a Reaper of the Wilds in play, it's very, very hard for them to come back and win. We have a second copy of Silence the Believers, again for those same matches where you're dealing with things like Polukranos and Stormbreath Dragon, and even for matches where you're dealing with things like Obzedat, Ghost Council. It is unfortunate that you can't deal with Bloodverin of Vizcapa with the Silence the Believers, but we do have things like Ancient Silverback that'll let us deal with that in a roundabout, inefficient, but effective way. We have 3 Stain the Mind. I don't really like Stain the Mind as a card in the standard format, but it is a concession to the incredible inevitability that Sphinx's Revelation gives to the blue-white control decks against this deck. Because our goal is to run the opponent out of cards and then present threats that are difficult to deal with, if they have a full hand of cards at every stage of the game, it's very, very difficult for us to execute our game plan effectively and close the game out in our favor. So Stain the Mind comes in, along with Elixir of Immortality, to just give us multiple chances to try and sneak past counters and take their Sphinx's Revelations out of the equation. Then once Sphinx's Revelation has been dealt with, we can also go after their win conditions like Aetherling or Elspeth Sun's Champion, and then finally their Elixir of Immortalities to just let us have complete inevitability and lock them out of all ways to win the game against us. The problem with Stain the Mind, as opposed to something like Slaughter Games, which would require a red splash, is that it is vulnerable to counter magic. We really don't want to get Stain the Mind countered, which is luckily why we have things like Thoughtseize that can give us a look at the opponent's hand. It also can let us know in other matches where Stain the Mind might be relevant, which I don't know of any right now, but it's possible they could exist. We can Thoughtseize them first and see what's in their hand, and then Stain the Mind to take the best card out of their hand. So we're not losing card advantage like you often are when you're just taking cards out of your opponent's deck. Again, we have another Ancient Silverback, just to bring in against those decks where it's good. The black-based Devotion decks, the white-black midrange decks, and the blue-white control decks, that all have difficulty dealing with a large regenerating creature. We have a second copy of Garruk, Apex Predator. Again, in the matches where this card is strong, it's very good to have access to extra copies. Just in case they deal with the first one, for example, if you play Garruk and -3 to destroy a Polukranos, it's often possible that your opponent can deal 2 damage to it and kill it before you can use another ability. Without bringing in Elixir of Immortality, it's good to have access to another copy in your deck so that you still have the ability to draw Garruk as an out. Finally, at 9 mana, we have a copy of End Garruk's Wake. This is just a concession to another matchup that is good at fighting us along the same axis that we want to fight on. The red, green, or Jund monsters decks or planeswalker decks can present a lot of creatures and planeswalkers that generate a strong advantage each turn. For example, Xenagos is a planeswalker that can create creatures for free every turn. It's not impossible to kill the Xenagos with something like Hero's Downfall or with combat damage, but that leaves all the creatures in play. Because those matches can be quite grindy and go a long time, we often have access to 9 mana or more, so we can play in Garruk's Wake, completely destroy everything relevant on their board, and then still have everything that we have. It's a Plague Wind that also hits Planeswalkers. It's not very good in most matchups, but in the matchups where it's good, it's incredibly strong. So that's the green-black rock deck that I've been playing in Standard. If you have any questions, please post on the YouTube comments, and I'll try and get back to you. Thank you.